second. And when it goes red, yes, it's red. Okay, so I'm here today with traditional liberal John. Hopefully, we're gonna have a nice chat about, as it says in the title, words, violence, and what the sort of two's relation is, I suppose. So, firstly, John, how are you today? All right?
Oh, I'm doing pretty good. Got a busy day planned, but definitely time for this.
Fantastic. I mean, we are a few hours apart. Obviously, I'm in the UK. John's a bit further back in the States, but it's the wonders of modern technology have let us come together to have this chat. So, as I just send I don't know what we call it on Blue Sky, a post. Just post that quickly. Right. So I'll let you, I suppose, start, John. Or I'll give a bit of an introduction actually. Yeah. So I in my recommended, I often get sort of videos from not just the larger of creators, but anyone from across the thing, and I quite like that. I quite like having a nice broad remit of stuff. It's almost more authentic seeing what the average person just thinks, as opposed to some person that's got millions and millions of followers and such. But I came across your video, and it was titled "Our Words Violence," and I listened to it, and I found myself a little less than in agreement with it. I sort of thought that, in fact, I didn't agree with it really. But I thought, well, let's hear this person out. Let's sort of think about what is being said here, and why not ask them to have a chat? Because it's always better to hear someone directly than sort of guess what they're saying. I mean, we can get quite close with words in sort of text, right? But it's better to hear someone out directly.
Well, and the YouTube comment section is not the best place for detailed discussions.
No, exactly. But yeah, that's how we sort of got this together, and hopefully we'll have a nice chat here. So I'll let you come in now. What would you say? I suppose was your thought process almost like what's the like idea that sort of
Well,
goes into when you say it?
to firmly state my beginning position, words can be hurtful, they can be hateful, and they can lead to violent action. And they should be taken seriously and sometimes even met with strict consequences, but they are not the same as violence, which directly causes physical harm or even death.
Yeah. Okay.
And so,
And so,
and
oh, go ahead.
I,
Sorry.
well, and I just wanted to add, I understand that, different countries have different laws and different attitudes and cultures surrounding free speech. So, that may be part of the disagreement here too.
I suppose it's wrapped in there somewhere. But
Yeah.
am I right in understanding that there's this? You want to almost distinguish the difference between the violence of, say, like a blunt force trauma, and the violence
hmm
of a spoken insult or something, right? Like,
Yeah. So, I understand that, words, especially over an extended period of time, can lead to chronic stress. And chronic stress can cause physical injury. It can even shorten your telomeres. But it's not the words themselves that cause this, but our emotional reaction to them, if that makes sense.
yeah, no, that makes sense. But we're emotional creatures, right? Like we exist in a plane of existence in which words do have meanings. Because like
hmm
if I said like I don't know, blip, blop, bloop, like it wouldn't make much sense because they're just making up words. But
hmm
because yeah, when we're talking now, the things we're saying have meaning because of course we do. We
Yeah.
live in a society where we speak English in our
Well, and
countries,
and
and
if you
so
don't have an agreed upon meaning, then communication breaks down.
exactly there's that
You know,
social
I've
connection.
actually I've actually had discussions where the other person will insist that a word's meaning is completely dependent on what the person who said it was actually thinking. And my response to that is to usually type out a sentence and then replace all the nouns with something else like, vegetables or suspension bridges and see, it's like, well, that's what I meant. Clearly you could understand that, right?
Exactly, like there's a social meaning that makes words have a
hmm
meaning. Um,
Yeah.
but I would say that in terms of what we're saying here, I mean, there's lots of different angles we could approach this with, right? Like the fact that some words have a meaning which is connected to their social history, their weight makes
Yeah.
them different to others. So if someone says, "Hey, watch where you're going," then you might feel a bit upset by it, but you would sort of think, okay, well, there's a connection to that. But if that phrase had some other words attached to it, some nouns which perhaps came from a place of marginalization, a place in which there was a
Well,
social
the U.S.
violence
certainly
history
has a
behind it.
history with that.
Exactly, exactly. That would be why there'd be that violent quotient to it. And I would then also
Hmm.
say as well, because you brought up the point about chronic stress, which I think is a very good point. You know, there's clearly you can imagine a toxic workplace, say, where someone is going to work and they feel bullied and mistreated and generally
Yeah.
aren't having a nice time. That
Hmm.
person, as well as facing stress, which, as we know, has physical effects in the body, has a mind which is constantly thinking about the ways in which they're going to mediate
Hmm.
their violence, the things that affect them in their life. And whilst they aren't as tangible as, say, someone's fist going into you, it's still something which affects the mind, which produces effects of the body, and ultimately affects the mind, which is a part of your body and therefore does feel, to some extent, the words which are felt. And whilst it's not
Yeah.
something we can touch, I would say that yeah, we can't touch things like time, but we still know that time exists. No one would say that, like, say, sleep deprivation is something which isn't a serious concern just because we can't touch it or can't see it happening.
Yeah.
It's still something that we can recognize in the social world. So that's why I think I would sort of start with responding to what you just said there.
Yeah. Well, and going back to what I said about the emotional reaction to a word, we don't have a lot of conscious control over our initial reaction to something. Somebody says something hurtful or hateful, and there's an immediate emotional response. But after that immediate response, through practice and hard work, we can learn to change how we react to things. So, let's say you know, somebody sees my views on traditional marriage values and calls me a Nazi. Well, obviously, I'm not a Nazi, but that's going to trigger an emotional reaction. But I can take a deep breath and say, you know what, this person is an idiot, and just move on with my day. And I also recognize that yes, this takes practice. It's not an easy thing to learn how to do, and it's going to be easier for some than for others. But I still think that it's valuable and it prevents those words from doing actual harm to me. If I sit there and dwell on it all day, then yeah, that's going to lead to chronic stress. But if you can learn to let go of things, then the words lose their power.
But that's a different argument, isn't it? Because whether or not someone dwells on what the word's effect on them is, or how they think about that word, doesn't change the negative act that's been done upon them. For instance, someone that is training to be a boxer may
Hmm.
learn to build their muscle mass and may learn to take a punch and know how to sustain themselves through a fight. But that doesn't change a person punching them having an effect on them. In the same way that, like, you
Well,
might, like, someone could learn to um, like when I play any sports, right? I mean, I'm a huge
hmm
sports fan. I love any sport. One of the things you're, as well as learning to be physically really great, you got to be mentally strong because if you're playing in front of a crowd and they're booing you because you play for the other team, you've got to be able to think, okay, this sucks, but I'm going to rise above it and score the goal. But that doesn't change that the crowd are still doing something which makes there an effect. You still, even when you've gone from playing in the local park to the World Cup final, you still have to learn to take on that challenge because there is still some action that's taking place in the same way
well,
that the word has a weight.
let's go back to your boxing analogy. If somebody hits me in the jaw hard enough to dislocate or break my jaw, no amount of mental discipline is going to keep my jaw from being dislocated or broken. That happened. It's a direct consequence of the impact of the fist. Whereas if somebody says something hurtful or hateful, the mental discipline can determine whether or not physical harm is done, or psychological harm rather.
Well, I
So
mean,
so
you could. That I mean, that's
Go
not.
ahead.
It's the same. Sorry, no, it's the same thing, right? Because like the force that is applied to break someone's bone can be offset by gaining the mass. If like it was rugby for me, American football, I suppose, would be your sort of quicker sport of choice, right? But if like I right now was to be tackled by a quarterback, like I'm probably going to break a few bones. I'm going to be quite seriously injured. But
Hmm.
if that same player tackles me after I've spent a few years training and gaining the muscle mass and eating and
Hmm.
changing my sort of habits and such, I've got a much better chance of actually withstanding the tackle, and maybe I'll even not be knocked over by it because I've built
Yeah, I mean,
the
your
strength.
injuries would be lessened, definitely.
Yeah, but
But
so then that demonstrates that in both those situations, be it a verbal or a physical injury,
mhm.
that yeah, of course, people can learn to be able to cope with it themselves. But that doesn't change the force that's gone into it and the energy that's gone into it, which is the whole point. That there is still a violent act that's been made by the situation. I'm just gonna shut my blinds and turn the lights on because
Yeah, no problem.
it's a bit darker in the UK than I thought it was gonna be. A bit cloudier. Give me 1 second.
Yeah, no problem. I should have brought a cup of coffee over here.
Right. Sorry. Hello.
Yeah, no problem. Um, but let's actually move away from sports and to something that anyone should be able to agree is violence, a knife or a gun. Okay.
Yeah.
So with physical training, you may be able to reduce the amount of injury done to you, but a knife or a gun, it's it's going to injure you no matter what. Whereas with words, through mental training, you can basically decide not to let it injure you at all.
But whether or not like the mental training isn't really the because I'm not saying that someone can't learn to be a more
Hmm.
resilient person to things that are said. But firstly, that's not the fact that they can be resilient doesn't change that something has been said to them which is an unpleasant or in this case violent act. And secondly, like who's to like because a knife and a gun, you're quite right, like a trauma of that nature is more likely to you
Hmm.
can't make your skin strong enough to repel a bullet, for instance. Like you're not
Right.
is it Emma Frost from X-Men? Yeah, you haven't got superpowers. But at the same time, we don't know what a person can produce from them, which has the chance to upset you. Like people can be the strongest person mentally ever, and they
Hmm.
can be really resilient, but suddenly something happens to them and they're not expecting it, and it can cause a crack in the mind. It can make us feel a little bit upset, and that can be as simple as just an unsuspected comment from someone they thought they had a different connection to, or it can be as severe as someone in the street yelling something really obscene to them. But I
Yeah.
think the point isn't really sort of trying to quantify it and try and turn it into like a strict sort of standardized measuring system of sorts.
Hmm.
We're instead sort of trying to think, okay, we can clearly see that some acts go beyond just an unpleasant thing and maybe have a social weight which makes us want to say, okay, this is a form of violence. This is worth considering in the same um, lens that you might consider other attacks and therefore can be treated a bit more seriously.
Well, and I'm definitely not saying that words shouldn't be taken seriously, and they should even have consequences. Just because you have free speech doesn't mean you can go around threatening violence, for example. Certain kinds of hate speech are against the law. Um, but I just think that there is a distinction between something that directly causes physical bodily injury, such as a knife or a gun, and then something which triggers a process in your mind, and then your mind causes an injury. Because the injury wasn't caused by the words, it was caused by your thoughts and feelings surrounding those words. Now, words can be violent, as in describing violence or threatening violence, but I don't like equating words, which at the end of the day, it's vibrations in the air that carry a meaning for us, with a physical act of violence. if that makes sense.
I mean, I get what you're saying, but it's not like, of course they're going to have meaning because they, for as much as, like, obviously, of course, the words are just vibration, and of course, when we say stuff, ultimately they're not inherently, important. If I could speak fluent Spanish and I started speaking Spanish to you, and I can be saying anything, right? And you might know how to speak Spanish, right? Like, I don't
I
want
know a
to
few
assume,
words.
but exactly, right? But like, if we weren't speaking the same language and we didn't know how to understand each other, yeah, of course they wouldn't have that same connection. But clearly the things we're talking about, I think, do have that weight. And whilst for as much as we can say, like, yeah, obviously there's a difference between someone being stabbed and the body having a physical trauma, and someone having something said to them and the mind producing negative connections to it.
Mhm.
There's still an importance in identifying that, in the same way that a doctor would classify different types of violence as still violent but of different natures. And I
Mhm.
also think as well, even with like a physical stabbing, like, whilst obviously you have, like, if someone got stabbed, for instance, they'd have the physical trauma and hopefully that would heal, but there'd also be a mental trauma which isn't maybe
Yeah,
measurable to a
absolutely.
doctor, but there's maybe going to be some anxiety about doing certain things, using their
Mhm.
body in a certain way, maybe even just it's tricky to wake up and know that you've had this thing happen to you. And so,
Yeah.
in the same way that our sort of maybe more conventional medical sciences have finally started incorporating the mental health side of things, and maybe
Yeah.
have realised that it's important to offer therapy of the emotional sense as well as physical therapy to recover from an injury.
Yeah.
There's
I
that
had.
needing to.
Oh, sorry, didn't mean to
No,
interrupt.
go. Sorry, go ahead.
I was just going to say I had a traumatic event. Let's see, it was like 15, 16 years ago now, and I carried that with me for a really long time, and it actually ended up causing issues in the relationship with my current, with my now wife. But when I finally stopped carrying that with me, it made me stronger. Letting go of it and finally allowing myself to heal. And so I can appreciate that different things cause trauma at different levels for different people. I can. And I know that it can be very hard to let go of. But psychological trauma is the sort of thing that we do have the power to work through. And the other thing is, I think that if we call words the same thing that we call something like a stabbing or a shooting, then I almost feel like that could be a little insulting to people who have been victims of physical violence. I mean, you take someone who was assaulted and shot, and they survived, but they have physical scars from it, and then they hear somebody saying that words are violence, and they're like, no, what happened to me was violence. and
I mean,
and
well,
I almost feel like the irony here is that hearing that could cause mental injury to them.
so firstly, I'm very glad that you've recovered from the traumas in your past, and obviously, I'm very happy that you were able to make that recovery. Just thought I'd say that before I started talking about
Yeah.
the other stuff.
Well,
Um,
my
so
wife was instrumental in helping me do that too.
I'm very glad. It's good to hear that there's recoveries and such. Um, I think that the what you've just said there, like that someone comparing the two injuries, like, I think is a little bit flawed, right? Because if we someone could be hit by a car at high speed and need major surgery, and
Hmm.
someone else could fall down a flight of stairs and break their finger and need that taping up and such, right? Both those people have been injured, and both those people could say, I've been injured, I had to go into hospital. But that wouldn't cheapen or devalue either person's experience. Like, it's just the case that different things happen to different people, and so I don't think it's a case of anyone's trying to, like, order the weight of certain acts, but
Hmm.
in the same way that abuse could be someone making consistent unpleasant remarks about someone's weights, habits,
Hmm.
hobbies, etc. Like someone sort of demeaning someone's cooking all the time and saying, "Oh, that's a bit rubbish. You should really stop playing football. You're not very good at it." And then another person could be abused by literally facing physical trauma and having a really
Hmm.
dangerous home life. Both those people have been abused. One form of abuse is physical, one form is verbal, but neither one contradicts or cheapens the other. And so, in the same way, the situation you described, where one person maybe has had a serious assault and the other person's had some abusive stuff said to them, both of them have faced a form of violence. It's not just because the word violence has been used, just because the word violence has been used twice in both those scenarios doesn't mean that there's some contradiction. And if anything, I think that we should be, rather than sort of putting the weight on them to be like, yeah, define this properly so that you don't upset other people. It should be more, okay, well, both these people have suffered. How are we going to tackle the actual thing we should be thinking about, which is the fact that there has been someone or something has inflicted violence upon these people. Let's address that,
Hmm.
right? Like that's the real sort of spotlight, the actual perpetrator and cause of violence. And in the case of verbal, in the verbal example of this, I think that clearly, because the thing where usually when words being violence is used, we're sort of thinking about like as we've sort of hinted at here, like racism, sexism, bigotry,
Hmm.
of course, like the slurs and the words which are used to perpetuate discrimination and such. And I think that is still that's violence, and you've also got the like we often see it compared to like schoolyard taunting and such, where like someone's like, "Oh, you
Hmm.
suck, you're rubbish" and such. And I think that like whilst we wouldn't, I don't think anyone's gonna be saying, "Yeah, this was a severe violent act." It is still in the same category, in the same way that you might not describe someone like bumping into you on the train as violent, but there's still been some force. There's still been force applied to your body. If someone maybe has bumped into you and you've
Hmm.
been staggered back a little bit, there's still been an act there. The fact that socially or colloquially we wouldn't really describe that as a violent act doesn't change that force has been applied to your body and it's been knocked. And so, in the same
Yeah.
way, I think with verbal stuff, whilst we're not sort of saying, yes, every single negative thing you hear is now the same as a serious assault, we can still be able to recognize that, yes, many things that are said in society do cause us harm and do have negative impacts on us in the same way that other forms of violence do, and that it's useful to describe these forms of social action in these terms.
But is that harm that is done caused by the words, or is it caused by our reaction to the words?
But the fact we react to it doesn't change that. Like obviously, the reaction is important to
Hmm.
recognize, right? Like if you didn't know what the word meant, you might not react. If someone from another language insulted you, but you didn't speak their language, you wouldn't
Hmm.
maybe your day wouldn't change, right? But that's almost a bit redundant saying that because of course words are going to have a reaction because they mean things in society. If I say to you, "Oh, you uh, door handle," or you plank of cardboard, like it doesn't make any sense, like because I just sound ridiculous because I'm just saying things. But
Hmm.
if I said like really vulgar stuff, whilst maybe you wouldn't care because I'm just some guy on the internet, but at the same time, there's clearly like you'd recognize that I was being unkind, unpleasant, and so there's clearly a
Yeah.
negative action carried in the things that would have been saying in this scenario. And so in the same way, for as much as it's important to have people, of course we should have people confident enough to say, yeah, you are a chump and a fool. I don't need to put up with this in my life. Get lost and
Hmm.
move on with the day and such. But that doesn't change that something happened. We should still be focusing on why
Right.
the
Something
the words
happened.
are said. Yeah,
Yeah, something
and
definitely happened. But I'm just saying, when an act of violence is carried out, there's there's no way that you can just decide this isn't going to hurt me. You know, if somebody shoots me, I can't just decide, no, I reject that. That gun didn't matter.
yeah,
I don't care about that bullet's opinion. If it hits me, it hits me. Period. Whereas, with words, you can make that decision. You can decide this isn't going to hurt me. I'm not going to let it. And so that I think is the big distinction here. You know, there was a quote. Unfortunately, I found the quote, but I couldn't find who it was attributed to. It was someone. All I found is that it was someone. that a philosopher admired. But it says civilization began the minute someone hurled an insult instead of a stone.
It's a curious quote. I would say
Yeah.
that I do slightly disagree with what you're saying though about being able to like you can just you're quite right. You can't if someone shoots me, I can't decide whether or not the bullet
Hmm.
impacts me. It's very much did it hit any serious organs? Is it going
Hmm.
to require surgery, etc., etc.
Yeah.
But the same does also apply, I think, with the words because whilst obviously, like it's easy to imagine it if it's like I don't know, someone you walked down the road and someone in a car yelled, "Oh, I don't like you, you ugly" or something, and then
Hmm.
you think, "Wow, that guy's a bit weird," and move on. But firstly, even in that scenario, that has still created a memory. That's still something our brain has had to process, and even the strongest
Hmm.
person will have some residue in there that's going to have brought that up. But secondly, if we hear words that have that meaning and have a negative quotient, that can impact all day, even if it's just thinking about it for a little bit longer than we would do normally, even if it's just something which took some time out of our day to process, that is an impact. And on top of that, there's a social weight, I
It's an
think, which makes
impact,
it,
but is it an injury?
well, yeah, in the sense that it's changed the way our brain has conducted itself in that day, in the same way that when you were impacted by someone's physical action, that had a physical effect on your body, which it had to deal with. Your body had to dedicate resources to responding to
Hmm.
whatever trauma was done to it. Your brain had to respond to whatever has been
Okay,
said to
but
you.
I work largely outside. The
Yeah.
weather has an impact on me. It changes how I conduct my business, the way that I walk, what I'm wearing, what I do with the paperwork, if it's pouring down rain. But I mean, we wouldn't call the weather violent.
Well, I mean, we would
I mean,
sometimes, wouldn't we? Like a hurricane.
okay. But just because something has had an impact doesn't make it an injury. A change is not always an injurious thing. You know,
No, but
so
this
somebody
would
says
be.
something hurtful, and I spend a few minutes thinking about it before I let it go. It doesn't mean I've been injured. It doesn't mean I've been hurt. It just means a thing happened, I processed it, and I moved on.
Okay, but in the examples we've given, we're like, where someone is yelled something out of a car,
It's
like,
also tricky having this conversation because the really egregious examples of what we're talking about are things that you and I don't want to repeat out loud.
well, indeed. But I reckon that sort of
Yeah.
shows that we do understand there is some weight to it. But I do get what you're saying.
Hmm.
I think that even if you thought about it only for a minute and then never again, that is still an impact. And like I said earlier, the fact that something isn't something we'd colloquially call an injury doesn't change that there was an impact. Like you wouldn't maybe if you I'm trying to think of something like if you held your hand on a radiator for a fraction of a second too long and pulled it away, um, you might not think about that again all day because it's like you just were a bit uncomfortable for a split second, but your body was still impacted by that. It sent a response to your brain saying, "Hey, my hand's getting too hot. Pull that away from there now." And so that is still, even in a minute way, something which impacted your body and did have a very temporary, and one that's not going to last any longer than that fraction of a second, but an impact that's negative on your body, an injury. And so I think this is where it's important to connect it to the social reality too, because you said about earlier, if you got stabbed or shot, you can't choose to, your body can't choose what it does. You have to sort of go to a medical professional. But
Yeah.
what we can do is think sociologically about what has happened there. Why are there places where it's more likely that you'll be shot and stabbed, and why are there not? And how can we build a society where violence is less common of that nature?
Hmm.
And so, largely in developed Western countries, we've been quite fortunate to be able, not fortunate, we've been able to build societies in which you can walk down the street and it's most likely that you'll get to where you're going without being impeded
Hmm.
by someone.
Yeah.
And you compare that to 100, 200, 500 years ago, and
Oh
it's
yeah.
massively improved, right? Like we're fortunate to live in countries where this is the case. But
Yeah. I mean,
in this,
even globally, the rates of violence have gone down in most parts of the world. You know.
massively, I mean, obviously, we're saying this at a time where it's not as though um, war
when
and violence have
there's
ended.
pretty awful stuff going on right this
Yeah, no,
minute, but
exactly, exactly, exactly. But like, I get what you're saying is correct, right? Like compared to the past, this year right now is a less violent time, and we are in a better place as a species than in many other points in human history, right? But
but
in the
oh, sorry.
same way, in the same way, the social world can be analysed through this lens as well. When
Hmm.
something is said to you, of course, a person can think, yeah, I don't want to be affected by it. But we should also think, okay, why has someone said this? And so this brings us to our sort of the social problems and the bigotries and such, and the reasons
Yeah.
that many of the things that get described as a verbal form of violence are said, and they link back to things which aren't okay and don't have a justification. Racism, sexism,
Hmm.
homophobia, transphobia, ableism, all these sorts of discriminations and bigotries which are unjust, which don't have a good reason for existing. Like you could, if someone, if you walked out into the road and someone had to hit the brakes really quickly, and they're like, "Oh, you're an idiot. What are you doing?" Like
Yeah.
you might think to yourself, "Okay, well that wasn't very nice," but maybe there's a bit of a, you can sort of see why they might have said that.
Yeah.
They were angry in that moment. They've driven off. Maybe I'll be a bit more careful next time crossing that road. But if I did that and they start yelling out racial expletives and they start saying stuff which is really
Hmm.
offensive, that maybe I'm used to it, right? Maybe I've had it before and I think, okay, that guy's a racist. I don't care what they think, but
Right. And
that still
that's
has
obviously something that I haven't dealt with. You know.
exactly. But like you can imagine, I'm trying to think like we've all got areas that, like if someone called
Religious or political.
yeah religious, political are
Yeah.
a little bit different, I think. But I mean, well, it's a bit of a grey area. It's different, I think, to some of the stuff I just said then. But like, it could be, yeah.
Hmm.
But like, I mean, like if someone has said something which has that social weight beyond just
Hmm.
like the human interaction, that is going to have a different feeling. That's going to have a different weight to it. And because it
Yeah.
has an unjust weight in that example that I've just given, if the guy saw me on the street, not even if I'm crossing the road, just saw me on the street and started yelling out racial slurs and such, regardless of how strong-willed I am, there is a clear negative social impact that stuff that has been said to me has, and therefore we should think, okay, this is a form of social violence. Let's work backwards to the social problem, in this case racism, but it could be many of the things I listed,
Hmm.
and try and address that. And I think that is where we're sort of getting at when people say words can be violence, because we want to fundamentally move away from just the oh, this word is just wind passing, as Zalrock says in the chat, and instead think about the actual social problem, the racism, the sexism, etc.
Right. And I think that those social problems need to be addressed. I don't think that there is any room for racism, sexism, or any kind of bigotry in a civilized society. Um, and I think that when someone decides that they're going to publicly or even privately express bigoted opinions, that there should be consequences for that. It should be dealt with and it should be taken seriously. I just think that we need a different word to describe it than violence. Words can hurt or frighten, but they're not going to cut, bruise, break bones, or kill you. If somebody says something, incredibly bigoted and it really hurts your feelings and you're thinking about it all day, it's not the words that did that. You've taken that meaning and you've internalized it, and then you've dwelled on it, and that is what caused the injury.
But I mean, firstly, I think that it's again that point that yeah, of course, the word physically, literally didn't, like if you were a physicist
Hmm.
from like Mars, if you were an alien, like if you looked at that and you didn't know what was being said, like you wouldn't say, oh yes, that word has been spoken and then just obliterated someone. But firstly, like I said, like the words have meaning. So of course our
Yeah.
brains, of course, are gonna process it, and it's gonna have an effect. But secondly, the words are a large part of what fuels much of the like violence. Like if someone like if there was like a mob, a racist mob that it's a bit getting a bit grim, isn't it? If there's some hate crime that's taken place, right? If
Yeah.
there's some attack that takes place,
Hmm.
chances are they're going to be saying slurs, and they'll have maybe in the police investigation that follows, they found some chat log somewhere where they've put a load of slurs and said, "Yeah, I can't wait to go and beat up so and so slurs and such." And
Right.
whilst the words themselves haven't physically attacked, they have clearly accompanied and been part of the rhetoric which has led to and is associated with the violence, as well as
Yeah,
the
and I
physical
absolutely
act.
agree that words can lead to violence or incite violence or threaten violence. I
And are part
absolutely
of it
agree
as
with
well.
that. See, but and that's it's funny, we agree like 90% here. um, but another point here. Um, if we consider words violence, then we also have to consider the implications of that because I don't know the laws in the UK, but in the most of the United States, if someone is committing an act of violence against you, you are allowed legally to use violence in response, even to escalate it. If somebody starts wailing on me and I have a gun, in most states I can legally shoot and kill them and call it self-defense. So you can even escalate violence. So if words are violence, then what is to stop physical violence from becoming an appropriate response to hateful words? Somebody says something upsetting to me and I punch them.
Well, it's an interesting question. I mean, I think if we think about physical violence, because you're quite right, self-defense laws exist, and
Mhm.
there's it's not quite the same in the UK, but you still have that
You also
general.
don't have
If
a
you
gun problem in the UK.
well, exactly right. Like it's a little bit of a different situation. Like we don't have like stand your ground laws and such.
Hmm.
But there's different as scales and there's magnitude, right? Like if someone pushes me on the street and then I come back later with a big club and just like start beating them. Like I'm still going to be at some point in court explaining why all this has happened, right? Like it's not as
Hmm.
though it's just okay. Well, you have had one thing happen to you, so now it's just free game, fair game to do anything. But I think it's very much the case that with this sort of verbal violence, like it's not as though like myself and others would say, yeah, it's just free for all. If someone says anything to you, that's violence, and you can just attack them. It's
Hmm.
firstly the case that we again would stress prevention's better than cure. Let's analyze the society and think about why this violence is happening, and
100% agree.
therefore that is our sort of point of analysis. But I mean, there is a point to say, I think, that where if like say racists and such and
Hmm.
sexists and bigots felt more afraid to say the stuff they did in public and out in politics and such, and certainly what we're seeing now, where you've got almost just open bigotry from Republicans across the country,
Yeah.
like it would be very much the case that it would be a lot safer for a lot of people. I think the worry about lot of because it's not as though bigots don't exist anymore. Like when
Hmm.
um, Civil Rights Acts passed, lots of progress has been made. It's not as though they all sort of their heart grew 3 times the size like in The Grinch and they just suddenly stopped being bigots. Like a lot of them were still there, but
A
they
lot of them still
saw
are
and
there.
exactly, sort of still alive, right? People who were there then voting for Trump now, but
Yeah.
it's the case that they felt and saw more of a consequence for their bigotry, and that's Martin Luther King, peaceful protest, Black Panthers,
Hmm.
all sorts of stuff that was done to clearly show, okay, black people are no longer going to tolerate this treatment. We're going to fight for our rights, and we're going to get it because we're not going to go away. And so,
Right.
in that sense, if we sort of rewind back to what you were saying, like if someone says something to you, can I punch them? I think it very much depends. Like in the same way that it would be justified maybe to defend yourself if someone literally was like punching and kicking you and trying to beat you up, versus maybe you wouldn't launch into that if someone bumped into you on the street and you started doing that. It's the same
Yeah.
thing with verbal stuff. Like if someone said something to you that's a bit tactless, like obviously there's different routes you might take. But if
Hmm.
someone's really in your face, like some racist
Can we,
is actively following you around, right? Like of course
can
there's
I
a bit of a difference there. Yeah, of
can I
course, go ahead.
pause for just a sec? I'll be right back.
Yeah, absolutely. I'll read the chat for a second. Wembley Jet says, "Hello, I am drunk." Well, everyone is sometimes, right? It's not. I'm sure. I'm sure sure you'll be all right. Hopefully, you're drinking something nice. And one of my viewers has had a few to drink. So
Oh, okay.
one of
That's
our
fine.
viewers, I should say.
Yeah. Um, no, I don't think that we're disagreeing on how words can have an impact and how they have meaning and they need to be taken seriously and they can be connected to violence. And I think it really just boils down to semantics, you know. Um, I just think that if we classify the words as being violence in and of themselves, then it leads to all sorts of unintended consequences. And who gets to decide what words are violence? You know, obviously a transgender person is going to consider transphobic rhetoric to be violent. But what about, I have a friend who's a university professor, and I talked to him about this. And he asked, can a fundamentalist Christian in Kansas decide that any words in support of transgender people are violence and cannot be spoken in schools or other public spaces?
I mean, is that not a case of like if you write a law saying things are bad, what if someone else writes a law saying I think things are actually good? Like it's a bit. Of course, there's the chance that someone can exploit this line
Hmm.
of thought, right? But then that's the case for anything. Like someone could, as we're seeing now, right? Like when the far right get into political power and say, well, actually, there's been racism against white people. There's been sexism against men. We're actually
Or
need to
or
trash all that.
Hegseth,
Exactly,
the
right?
defense secretary, removing books on feminism, racism, critical race theory from military academy libraries because he feels threatened by them.
Exactly that. I think
So
that
is that
that
acceptable?
of course that's not acceptable, but the
Right.
fact that bad faith actors exist doesn't change that that there's social violence that takes place. And I think what the point you raise, right, like the fact that someone who is marginalized would say something is violence and shouldn't be permitted as such in a space may lead to someone else exploiting it. Like I think that that is a question of the wider social problem of bigotry and such. Because chances are that fundamentalist religious person in was it Kansas? You said, or was it
Yeah.
Kansas? Yeah, that person is probably one of the ones that the trans person would have said might be the
Hmm.
person responsible for some of that hateful rhetoric. And clearly, we're seeing now that the GOP are
Hmm.
fully engaging in that kind of just banal, hateful rhetoric for the sake of
Yeah.
scoring cultural points or whatever, right? But I think that again that shouldn't stop us from wanting to be seriously critical about what's happening here. And secondly, I think the fact that we haven't really had a proper we've come close, right? Like it's not as though we've made no progress, but wrapped
Hmm.
up in the discussion of bigotry and such is also the role of social power and the fact that, especially in a country like America, the influence and power of conservatives makes it very hard to actually move forward to many of the things that would make it easier for
Oh
marginalized
yeah.
people to exist in society. So
Oh yeah.
it's like the in the UK, for instance. I'm not trying to think. Like you only have to go back a few years, and some of the stuff like I know it's another sports one, but you'd have like 20, 25, 30 years ago, just all sorts of off-color jokes and remarks made about black players, about female players of sport.
Hmm.
The girls' team needs to go. Maybe go back to the kitchen instead, and it's like this is being said on national television, right? Like
Yeah.
it's just embarrassing, sort of thinking this was just like normal television like a few years ago or
Yeah.
black or
No,
things said
we've
about
definitely made some progress.
exactly like there's been progress, but because people have kicked off a fuss about it and said, yeah, this isn't okay. And so I think, whilst of
And they
course
should kick up.
there's
They should
yeah,
kick up a fuss.
exactly, but
Yeah.
at the same time, like part of that kicking up a fuss is identifying that there is clearly a problem with it and being willing to label that as something that is violent. And I don't think it contradicts the existing colloquial use of the term to also recognize that there's a severe effect that can take place. Because, like, to use the example of the let's say a gay football player, right? Like the gay player that wants to play football and then one day someone says the F slur to them. Maybe it's from the football stand, maybe it's the opposing team, maybe it's even one of their own teammates, because unfortunately that kind
Yeah,
of
yeah.
homophobia does exist in most spaces. Now that player physically might not have been touched once by any of these people,
Hmm.
but they now feel unsafe in that setting. They not only do they feel different in themselves, they're less confident, maybe they're less expressive as a sports person, but
Hmm.
they also have the fear of violence, because if someone's willing to say that to them, how do they know they're going to be not going to be facing the
Hmm.
physical threats that often come with a verbal insult? So
Yeah.
I think that whilst of course no one is saying that the spoken word has exactly the same physical force that Isaac Newton could measure as a punch or a kick,
Hmm.
but clearly there is clearly an association, a connection, and it is worth discussing these words in the same manner and in the same conversations. No one's saying it has to be exactly the same. No, I don't think anyone at all would say someone calling you a bit of a twit is exactly the same as like driving a car into you or something. But
Hmm.
it's in the same associations and conversations, and therefore it is still important, I think, to emphasize.
I think it's important to emphasize, and it's important to have conversations about this kind of behavior. Um, I don't know. I feel like we need a different word for it.
Why
And
is
I
that
think
though? Why do you feel
part
that
of well, and part of the issue is, you've been talking about some of the really egregious examples of this, but at least here in America, and I move in mostly liberal circles, but I hear the word violence get thrown out in relation to words like just willy nilly. Like it's like yeah, somebody just says something mean, you know, and they're like, "Well, that's violence." It's like, no, it's not. He was just mean, and there's always a choice. You can choose to internalize it. You can choose to remove yourself from the situation. If someone is committing actual violence against a person, their only choices really are to just sit there and be injured or killed, or to fight back. But if someone's coming at me with a knife, I can't just decide, you know what? No, I'm not going to do this today and walk away. I mean, that's not going to happen. Then I'm just going to get stabbed in the back. But with words, I mean, even if it's something like a workplace or a school, you may feel like you have no choice to be there. But there's always a choice, even if option B sucks.
But I mean, firstly, this still focuses on the person facing it instead of the act itself. Like we said earlier, right? Like even if it's the most mundane thing that's been said, that maybe
Hmm.
even you and I might say, yeah, maybe they could get over it. That is still something that's been said to them, which has that weight, even if
Right,
we
and the
don't
person
personally
saying
think
that
it's
thing was still wrong.
yeah. So that's like whether or not we think the person could have reacted differently and not been as upset by it. It doesn't
Hmm.
change that it's still an act that may have some impact. But secondly,
Right. But I
and
don't have any control over that other person. I have control over me. And it is entirely my responsibility to take care of my own mental health. I can't put that on anybody else. So if somebody speaking to me in a certain way is doing harm to my mental health, that ultimately it's my responsibility. I can't control them. I can't control what they're saying or how they feel or how they think or anything like that. I can control how I react to it. It is up to me. And
that is
I'm a
fine
big
in
believer in personal responsibility.
that's fine in lots of situations, and I completely agree. Right, like we have to be responsible for our own mental health, but
Mm.
what if that is something which is out of your like what if that's something which is socially the case, like if we are a member of a marginalized group that is facing
Hmm.
microaggressions in a workplace. Now it's all very well sort of saying yeah you can walk away, but if this is your place of work and someone's saying something,
Go to
then
HR.
what that doesn't that's not as easy as you might think, right? Because
I
HR
didn't say it was
may
easy.
also well exactly right, so that solution's not going to be effective for every person in that situation. But secondly, that also again leaves it to the person that is facing the unpleasantries to try and sort this out instead of maybe a wider sort of social analysis that says, okay, well, why is someone even saying this in the first place?
And I
Um,
think we should have that social analysis.
Yeah, exactly. That's what we're saying. That's why it's important to focus on the violence itself. And I think the fact that because I get that I get that there's of course there's people who maybe overreact to things that are said like someone says I don't think you played very well today. It's like how dare you say that? But clearly that isn't the case all the time. And whilst we might not have thought something was mean, someone else may have really taken it quite seriously because different people have different things. Like I go running quite a bit, right? So like when if you ask me to run 10 kilometers, I'd be like, okay, I'll go and do that. But someone else might do that and come back wheezing, exhausted, like really unwell. And vice versa. Someone might be a really great rugby player and be able to take a tackle and do really physical, impressive like shoulder barges and stuff. Put me in that situation, I might get flattened and I might end up with broken bones and stuff. So clearly, there's a subjective element to these things that I think it's important to emphasize. Can I ask what you said earlier, like a mean thing being described as violence, sort of irks you sometimes? Would you mind giving me an example of what sort of thing you might
Oh,
be meaning?
well, like calling someone a name, or just saying, "Well, that's a stupid thing to say." You know, little things like that I've heard described as being violence.
Well, it depends on the context, right? Because if it like whilst on the offset it might not be interpreted as that like from us, right? Because it's just like maybe it's something trivial, maybe it's something that hasn't had that weight. But when connected to things which are meaningful in society, like let's say someone put some time into doing something for a loved one or someone they cared about. Like you spent the afternoon cooking a meal and you spent a long time doing it, and your partner or someone in your family comes home and you're like, oh, here's your meal. I spent ages doing this, and they're like, wow, that sucks, and get their phone out and they order a takeaway instead. That symbolically may have a really negative effect on you. And that isn't maybe the same thing as being beaten up or even having a slur thrown at you. But that symbolically, that emotionally can have a toll. And that
Oh, it's
toll
definitely
may
hurtful.
be characterized as violence, even if we don't see it that way. Even if it doesn't feel right, maybe associating that in the same way as a direct assault or something intentional. There is still a negative quotient to that. But I think the area we're more thinking of, because I would describe that as, whilst I would say that is still, you could still frame characterize that as violence. I would say again that the area we're sort of really focusing on when we're describing a verbal element as being violent is um, the microaggressions and such. Like, so to go back to that HR situation, as Alok said, HR doesn't even care sometimes, and that's unfortunately the case. Right, there's some workspaces where the nature of the social organization is one where people maybe have already formed connections, and
Hmm.
maybe you are, say, a trans person who is trying to speak about your situation, but unfortunately it's tricky because the person in HR also maybe doesn't have the best attitude towards it. Maybe
Yeah.
you're a disabled person who
You know,
um,
a big part of going to HR is establishing a paper trail so that if any action needs to be taken at a later date, everything is documented. You don't necessarily expect, to make an HR complaint. Maybe someone is being religiously intolerant towards me and I go to HR. I don't necessarily expect them to do anything, but it's documented. And if anything does happen later or anything needs to happen, then there is a paper trail documenting this.
but that's
Going to
still
HR is a big part of it is just protecting yourself.
yeah. But I agree, right? But that's still, and firstly, that still work for the person to have to do with response to something that was said to them. But secondly, that is still something which is potentially subject to the person's, the
Hmm.
HR team and the wider workplace's perceptions, which are informed
Yeah.
by the social reality we live in. And so, the words that are said are often as well. I think it's also like, the the mundane is tricky to go to someone about, right? Because unfortunately, and you've a term microaggression, right? Like something which is sort of just in the everyday, something which isn't something you could maybe concretely point to in the same way that like a racist word being written on your desk is or something, but it's clearly still going to have a negative impact and does take its toll over time. And so
Yeah, but a
if
negative
you're,
impact doesn't necessarily mean injury.
well, we'll never know, but at the same time, like you and I might brush off a paper cut, but someone else might really be that might really ruin someone else's day. Like it's just because it doesn't seem like it would have an impact doesn't mean that it doesn't have one, and doesn't mean that it could still be construed and framed as something which is violent, even if it's not overtly the most obvious form of it. It's like if, and to go back to that example of someone saying, "Oh, that was a stupid idea." Like imagine you're in this workplace and someone makes that comment to you, and then the next day someone else makes that comment, and you notice that you're just getting all this sort of negative language being used towards you yourself, and maybe as well as that, there's also this unease and this sense of like you don't have the same social connections and such. Like it's trickier to just go to HR or just take the choice that you called it earlier
Yeah.
to do that. And most importantly, even if someone had all the options available, even if they had the world's best HR department and they could switch jobs in an instant and it was all like set up for themselves, that would still not disqualify the initial comment as being something which was negative. And even it, like I say, even if it's not at all something which is going to have a lasting impact, even if it hurt in just that split second it was said and they never thought about it again, that still doesn't change that there was something of a violating nature that was done to them. And yeah, of course they can get over it, and of course that they might be able to be, brush it off in an instant. But
Well, see, and
it
I
still
agree.
happened.
It could be hurtful. It could feel violating. Um, I just, I just don't see it in uh, the same vein as physical violence. And I want to apologize. We've only got about 5 minutes left.
That's all right. It's okay. It's all
Yeah.
right. But it's an adjective, isn't it? It's like
Mhm.
an elephant is big, but if I was listing planets, it would be silly to say an elephant is big in comparison, right? Like,
Mhm.
I would say I'm quite fast, but if Usain Bolt and I had a race, I'm I'm gonna suddenly not quite look so fast, right? But in the same way that we would use the word violent to describe things, and if you put certain acts like that paper cut I was describing earlier, if that is being put next to like someone opening fire with a machine gun, like of course my paper is going to seem a bit silly calling it violent, but it's all relative, and so there's still an element of importance in thinking critically about some of these things and thinking they are in that sense. And I think to because I know you've got to go in a second. There's I think a really important thing for me, and what really makes it stand out, what makes it so important, is the sense that violence in our current political climate is taking place on the literal sense. So, like an ICE in America, you've got
Yeah, yeah,
ICE raids. We have immigration raids in the
yeah,
UK, which thankfully aren't quite on the same level, but give it a few years, and who knows where we're going to be, right?
yeah.
You've got bombings happening in the Middle East, which are really
Uh-huh.
horrific, and we all see the images and such. But you've also got the verbal stuff happening. The fact that the administration constantly dehumanize people of marginalized status, the
Yeah,
disgusting rhetoric they used in pretty much every instance they can, that is a form of verbal and symbolic violence, which I think is just as important to critically discuss, because that's part of how the far right conduct themselves. And the unsafe and unpleasant world they create through that is definitely part of the process of which that is
yeah.
happening.
Well, and while I disagree that it is violence, I do agree that it needs to be addressed and it needs to be discussed critically. And, we need to deal out consequences. I mean, we can't, like I said, there's no place in civilized society for this behavior.
Mm.
So, I mean, it's the sort of thing I don't think either one of us changed the other's mind, but I enjoyed the discussion.
Well,
And
that's
I
good.
think,
Yeah, it was nice
you
chatting.
know, what, what I also think is really good here is that you and I were able to disagree on something, but to also find the areas where we did agree and have a civilized discussion that did not devolve into name calling as things on the internet often do. And I just want to say, I really appreciated that.
Well, I'm very glad, and I'm always open to any other topic that we find. I'm sure there may be another opportunity to chat again and such. But no,
Yeah.
it's I think on this topic, like it's very much a case of as you say, like we seem to be in quite a bit of agreement in quite a lot of the areas.
Mm,
In my mind, it's just almost tightening that, going the next step, right? Like sort of thinking,
mm.
what is the route to which we can best therefore address the things which are said, which end up causing problems in
Well,
society.
and the thing is, we may not agree on the definitions here, but I think we agree on what needs to be done about it.
Yeah, by and large, yeah.
Yeah.
The that sort of left wing change certainly from where we are with Trump now, anyway. But
Yeah.
anyway, I will let you go because I know you got stuff to be doing, and the day is long for you. I've got it's a bit darker in the UK now, so I've not got much
Yeah.
long left of my day. But no, thank you for coming on the show.
Thank you for
The
inviting
show,
me.
my channel, which is very much not a show. But yeah, no, you're more than welcome. Yeah, I think I'll end the live stream here. Thanks again, everyone, and I'll
Yeah.
hopefully catch another one soon. Thanks, guys.
Yep. Have a good evening.